Have you ever had somebody tell you that you're not good enough? That's no fun to hear, is it? It's not fun for somebody to say, well, you just weren't good enough. But as we grow up, as we mature in life, sometimes that is the message we need to hear, because the reality is, for all of us, there are things we're not good at, right? I love to play basketball, but God did not create me to play basketball. And so there was a point in my life where I had to realize I'm not good enough to keep playing this sport. I should look for something different. Some of you have probably experienced being not good enough in more painful ways. Maybe there was a relationship you really hoped would work out, but you weren't good enough to make that happen. Or maybe it was at work where you got passed over for a promotion, or you got passed over for a raise, and it was because your work just wasn't good enough. Nobody wants to hear this, but all of us understand there are times in life when we're not good enough. Now, where this really becomes a struggle for us is when we begin to think of the afterlife, right? What happens after we die? Is there something out there? Because you know what? Most people believe there is an afterlife. Most people believe that there's something after we die. I do funerals fairly often, and sometimes I'll do a funeral for a family who's not connected to our church, and they'll be up front with me and say, you know, David, we're not Christians, we don't go to church, we don't believe in God, we're not into all of that. And then 5 minutes later, they'll say something to me like, yes, we know our loved one is looking down on us, and we hope that someday we can be with them. And in those moments, I just want to say, Can I talk to you about how these things work together? Because they really do. But the truth is, as we think about the afterlife and what happens to us after we die, many of us, if not all of us, really struggle with this question, am I good enough? Am I good enough in this life to end up where I want to be in the next life? And this is a question that every world religion that has ever been around has tried to answer. What does it mean to be good enough in this life to get where you want to be in the next life? So Buddhism attempts to answer this question. A good Buddhist will tell you if you want to get where you need to be, you need to go through this cycle of life and death and rebirth and over, and where you really want to get is you want to escape that cycle. They call that nirvana. It's not the band, it's actually a place, and it's kind of just a oneness with everything. And to get there, what you need to do is you need to believe in the Four Noble Truths. The Four Noble Truths are that life is suffering, that suffering is the result of attachment or desire, that the solution for attachment is to let go, and if you can let go, then you'll lose your suffering. And so then the fourth truth is the way you let go of attachment is by following the eightfold path, which is essentially 8 principles that you live by. And if you live by those 8 principles, you'll let go of attachment, suffering will go away, and you'll be able to find yourself at one with everything. Hinduism is very similar. Now, Hinduism is kind of tough to define because it's really just this blanket term for a lot of different Eastern religions. But essentially, all of them would say the big thing to remember is that as you live, you're creating karma, right? You're creating good karma and bad karma, and that determines how you're going to go into the next life. So if you create more good than bad, then when you get reincarnated, you'll move up into a higher form. So maybe you'll be like a politician. Well, that would be the wrong direction. No, you'll be something better than you are now. And if you have more bad karma than good karma, then you're going to be reincarnated as something worse, like a snake or a dog or a cat. So they say there's good karma, and you need to create good karma for yourself. And if you do create enough good karma for yourself, then you'll be reincarnated until you reach the highest form, which is, again, oneness with everything. So Buddhism and Hinduism, very similar, right? Essentially what they're saying is you need to try harder, right? Try harder to have more good karma. Try harder to follow the eightfold path. Try harder, and you'll get where you need to go. Islam is not all that different. Islam would say, if you want to get to heaven, there are 5 pillars that you must hold to. The first is that you must recite and believe the Shahada, which is the statement, there is no God but Allah and Muhammad is his prophet. And if you say that and you believe it, you're on your way. You must pray 5 times a day while facing Mecca. You need to fast during the month of Ramadan. You need to give alms, which means if you have extra, you need to give a percentage of that to the poor. And then finally, if you can, if it's possible, you need to take a pilgrimage to Mecca. And if you do all of these things, then there's the possibility that Allah will let you in. But essentially, it's not all that different than Buddhism and Hinduism, because what they're saying is try harder. Try harder to follow the 5 pillars. You see, every world religion that has ever been invented is based on this principle of try harder, except for Christianity. You see, this is what makes Christianity stand out from all of the other religions, is that Christianity is not a religion of try harder. Now we start in the same place. We start in this place of saying that we're not good enough, okay? In fact, that's one of our core beliefs here at the gathering, is that nobody is perfect, because we all know that none of us are perfect. We all make mistakes. We all have regrets. We all deal with guilt, with shame. We know that we've not lived the best life possible. That's the starting point. We're not good enough. But while every other religion says the solution to that is to try harder, Christianity says you can't try harder. Because no matter how hard you try, you're never going to be good enough. Because you're not perfect. And it may seem unfair to make perfection the standard. Say, well, why does perfection have to be the standard? Why does sinlessness, why can God not allow imperfect people into heaven? Well, we all understand that sometimes in life it's important that perfection matters, right? We prefer perfection to, that's probably okay, right? When you get on an airplane and you see all the mechanics working on it out your window, and then the pilot's like, all right, we're going to go, and you go to the pilot, you say, are you sure the plane is ready to go? You don't want him to say, I think it's good enough. If I'm making you cookies, and you see my little dog Roscoe licking the dough, and you say, David, are you going to start over? And I kind of look at it and say, no, I think it's good enough. You're not eating those cookies, because sometimes a little bit of a problem is too much of a problem. Sometimes perfection actually matters. And when we're talking about eternity, all of us would prefer to live in an eternity without sin rather than an eternity with sin. And so God says, I'm going to preserve eternity, so those who live with me in eternity will live in a place where there is no sin at all. That's why imperfection can't get in. Now, someone might say, well, just a little bit's okay, right? Well, again, imperfection, a little bit of imperfection for a little bit of time is okay. But none of us want to deal with it forever, right? Some of you guys are big Cincinnati Bengals fans. And Joe Burrow's not playing yet. You're like, oh, is this okay? You know what? It's the preseason. I'm okay with no Joe Burrow for a little while, but I wouldn't be okay if Joe Burrow never played again. Because imperfection for a little bit of time is okay, but maybe not forever. If you're roasting marshmallows and the stick that you're using is an imperfect stick, that's probably okay. If you're building a house and your 2x4s aren't square, that's not okay. Because something that's going to last forever needs to be perfect. And so God says, if you want to be in heaven with me for eternity, the standard is perfection. And the problem is we cannot try hard enough to be perfect, because none of us are perfect. This is why Christianity is different. Everybody else says, try harder, try harder, try harder. God says, you can't try harder because you'll never hit the standard, so let me do something for you. And so God sent Jesus to earth, and Jesus lived for 33 years perfectly. He never sinned. He never said anything wrong. He never did anything wrong. He never thought anything wrong. He was perfect. And at the end of those 33 years, we, humanity, killed him. And as he died on the cross, he took upon himself all of our imperfection. The Bible actually says he who knew no sin was made sin for us. He became imperfect on our behalf so that he could kill our imperfection with him. And this is the really good news of Christianity. I don't need to try harder. I simply need to give my life to Jesus. And when I give my life to Jesus, he gives his perfect life back to me. Now, that doesn't mean I'm going to live perfectly, but it means that God credits me as having a perfect life. So when God the Father looks down at me, he doesn't see my imperfections. He doesn't see my sin. He doesn't see my shortcomings. He sees me through the filter of Jesus' blood, and that means he sees me as perfect, and he adopts me as his child. This is Christianity. No other world religion does it this way. Everybody else says, you're not perfect, you're not good enough, try harder. Jesus says, you're not perfect, you're not good enough, but I am, and you can have what I have done for you. Now, here's the deal. It's not enough to simply say, I'm giving my life to Jesus. It's not enough to just simply pray a prayer, I'm asking Jesus into my heart. You actually have to give him control of your life. A few months ago, our family drove out to Oregon. Our daughter's working out there now, and we wanted to bring our car out there, so myself, Marianne, and Emma, we drove out together. We've made this trip a lot of times now, and whenever we make the trip, I do most of the driving because I like to drive. So I'll drive a lot of the trip. But eventually, most days, near the end of the day, I'll say, you know what? I need a break. And I'll say, Marianne or Emma, I'll let you drive. Here, take the wheel. And when they do that, I get in the back seat and I shut up. Because nobody wants that person in the back seat, right? Who's like, okay, all right, get on the entrance ramp now. All right, get a little speed up. You got to have some more speed. Get your blinker on. You got to merge. All right, I see a gap here. Get ready. Merge into this gap. Merge in. There you go. Good. Okay, that truck's going a little too slow ahead of us. Why don't you get in the left lane and pass them? Make sure you put your blinker on. Get out past them. Okay, speed up a little more. You need to get past this truck. All right, we're past the truck. You need to get over in the right lane. Don't hang out in the left lane. Now, listen, people, listen to this. Don't hang out in the left lane. Seriously, some of you, stop it. Sometimes I almost lose my salvation over this. Pass and get over. That's how you do it. All right, back to the story. Nobody wants a backseat driver who gives you the wheel and then tells you what to do with it. But this is what we do with Jesus sometimes. We say, I'm giving control of my life over to Jesus. And then we say, and here's how I'm going to live it. That's not how it works. That's me just saying words that don't mean anything. If my life still looks exactly like it always lived, if I still do all the things that I always did, if I'm still the one who's trying harder, then I haven't really given my life to Jesus. But if I turn my life over to him and say, you've got control of my life now he does give me his perfect life, and now I am good enough for eternal life. Now, throughout all of history, mankind has struggled to figure this out. And until Jesus, nobody got it right. And so you go around the world, and everywhere you go in the world, every civilization that has ever existed, they have religions. And all of their religions come back to try harder, do more. 2,000 years ago, there was a group of people in kind of what we call north central Turkey. At that time, it was called the region of Galatia. And they were ancient descendants of the Celts. So they had all of their practices. They were pagans. They had their list of things they had to do to try harder, to be good enough. And so they offered sacrifices, and they had ceremonies and rituals, and sometimes they even offered human sacrifices. And they realized they were not good enough until one day this guy named Paul shows up. And this guy named Paul starts to tell them about Jesus, and he explains to them, look, all these things that you're doing to try to be good enough, it's not working, but let me tell you about a man who was good enough. And he told them about Jesus and how they could give their lives to him and receive his perfection that he purchased for them. And they heard the news, and they were glad, and they received it, and they gave their lives to Jesus. And Paul started churches there, and the churches started churches, and Christianity was flourishing. And after a little while, Paul left, and he went on to other places to tell other people about Jesus. But when Paul left, some other teachers came in who had a slightly different message. These were Jewish teachers who came in and said, Paul had some things right. Yes, Jesus is important. You should believe in him. But there's more to it than that. You see, they were Jewish, and they said Jesus was Jewish, and so you need to convert your life to a Jewish lifestyle. You need to obey the law of Moses. You need to go through all of the ceremonies to be part of the covenant. You need to honor the Sabbath. You need to observe our holy rituals. You need to start eating our diet. No more bacon, because it's not kosher. And the people heard these new teachers and began to wonder, well, wait a minute, what are we supposed to do? Because Paul said it's not try harder, and now here we're hearing try harder, and some of them began to fall under the spell of these Jewish teachers. And when Paul heard this, he got angry. And he quickly fired off a letter to them. If he was doing it today, he probably would have just done a social media post. You foolish Galatians. He actually says that in the book. But he wrote the letter called the Book of Galatians. We're going to get to it this week in our reading plan. So if you're doing our year-long reading plan, this week you'll be reading 2 Corinthians 12 to Galatians 3, which takes you right into the middle of this letter that Paul wrote. Now, Paul is writing this letter to kind of gently, but not so gently, correct the Galatians, but also to say to them really strongly and really firmly, Jesus did it all. You can't make yourself better. You have to rely on him. And so this morning, we're going to look at a couple of verses from this letter that are in the first chapter. So if you have your Bible, open it to Galatians chapter 1, and we're going to get started in verse 6. Paul says, I am astonished. I'm shocked. I'm appalled. I can't believe it. I am astonished that you are so quickly deserting him who called you in the grace of Christ and are turning to a different gospel. Not that there is another one, but there are some who trouble you and want to distort the gospel of Christ. Paul says these new teachers that you're listening to, they are distorting the gospel of Jesus. They are taking you from believe in him, trust in him, rely on him, and they're moving you to try harder. And Paul says, I am shocked that you're actually turning away from Jesus and turning to this religion of try harder. But listen to what he says next. We begin to really get a feel for how angry he is. He says, but even if we or an angel from heaven should preach to you a gospel contrary to the one we preach to you, let him be accursed. As we have said before, so now I say again, by the way, yes, Paul repeats himself here, and that means it's really important. Whenever you see somebody say the exact same thing twice in a row, especially in the Bible, pay attention. So he repeats himself. As we have said before, so now I say again, if anyone is preaching to you a gospel contrary to the one you received, let him be accursed. All right, I'm going to use bad language here in a second. You can kind of see that Paul is headed that direction. So I'm going to use bad language in a second. So, maybe earmuffs if you have sensitive ears. But what Paul is saying here, saying, if anybody comes to you and distorts the gospel of Jesus, what's the gospel? The gospel is very simply, Jesus did it all, we can't do it. If anybody comes and distorts that message, Paul says, let them go to hell. That's what he says. That's what it means. Let them be accursed. He says that is a message from hell, and they need to take it back to hell. Because the message of try harder, this idea that you can somehow on your own be good enough, this is a lie of Satan from the pit of hell intended to deceive you and distract you from the gospel of Jesus. And Paul says, stay away. Turn back to Jesus. Now, we have a word that we use for this, all right? This message that these new teachers were teaching, we have a word that we use for it today, and the word that we use is legalism, all right? You can see that comes from the law, legal. And the idea is legalism is any man-made law intended to make us righteous. So anything that we do that we say, because I'm doing this, God is going to be impressed with me. Right? We do this sometimes. We've all seen people who do this. And for some of you who've been in church for a long time, you hear that word legalism and you just start to get angry a little bit. This is me. I grew up in the church. I've been in the church my whole life. I was a Baptist most of my life, so I know legalism. Not all Baptists are legalists. Some of them get out of it, okay? But legalism is this thing that we do where we impose these rules on ourselves and others thinking that's how we make God happy with us, as if somehow I could impress God. There's nothing about me that is impressive to God. He is so far above me. And so Paul says, watch out for legalism. This morning as we talk about this, let me give you guys a warning, okay? What I don't want you to do today is I don't want you to think about the legalists you know, all right? I don't want you to think, oh man, I know who needs to hear this. You're the one that needs to hear this, okay? I'm talking to you. I'm not talking to anybody else. I'm talking to you. And so you need to look at this and say, where has legalism grown up in my heart? Because what you might discover is that it creeps into all of us because all of us like to think that we can be impressive to God. But the reality is all of us need Jesus. So let's talk about legalism, all right? Let's start here. Legalism begins with being too much of a good thing. I know it's hard to imagine that a good thing you could have too much, but we all know this is true, right? You can eat too many cookies. You can exercise too much. You can have too many possessions. There's a lot of things that are good things that you can do, but if you do too much, they become a bad thing. Now, for the Jewish people, this legalism that's coming to the Galatians, this was also birthed out of a good thing. This group of people called the Pharisees wanted to stay true to God and his law. And so because they wanted to be true to God and his law, they began to think about new laws that they could make that would help them be faithful to God's law. For example, the law says, honor the Sabbath, right? Set aside the Sabbath because God worked 6 days and he rested the seventh, so also you should rest on the seventh. So set aside the Sabbath, honor the Sabbath. That is a good thing. We are designed to be people who need rest, and it is good for us to inject into the rhythm of our life times of rest and renewal. That's good. But what the Pharisees did is they said, because the Sabbath is good, we're going to make it even gooder. And so we're going to make all these new rules about the Sabbath. For example, one of their rules was you cannot light a candle or a fire on the Sabbath. I'm not sure why they decided that was work, but they did. They said, you cannot light a candle or a fire on the Sabbath. If you light a candle or fire on the Sabbath, you are now sinning. But you can pay a Gentile to light a candle or a fire for you. Now just think about how much sense this actually makes. If it's a sin to light a candle or a fire, if it's not something you should be doing, then why would you pay someone to do it? If I wanted to kill somebody, I can't just go to Merle and say, Merle, will you kill this person for me? And be scot-free, right? I'm just as guilty as him. But in the Pharisees' warped idea, all right, so I'm going to obey this law. I'm going to pay someone else to disobey the law, and it'll be okay. One of their other rules that they made about the Sabbath was you can't walk more than 2/3 of a mile. Don't know exactly how they picked that distance, but they decided you can't walk further than this on the Sabbath. Well, then they discovered, there are times we actually need to walk further than that on the Sabbath. So what do? Well, they made a new law. And the new law was you can designate for yourself a Sabbath home. And so if you walk that distance to your Sabbath home, now you can start over because you're home. And what they would do is the day before the Sabbath, they'd say, what do I need to do tomorrow? Oh, I need to go to Kroger, but it's too far. So they'd go halfway to Kroger and find a tree and say, this tree is my Sabbath home. And so the next day on the Sabbath, they'd walk to the tree, less than 2/3 of a mile. I'm home, I'm starting over, walk the rest of the way to Kroger, everything's good. It's like, how is this possibly impressive to God? God's looking at it and saying, this is not impressive one bit, but this is legalism, where I take something good and I add on to it so that I can be impressed with myself. And what happens is, when we make these rules for ourselves, we begin to think, oh, wait a minute. Maybe I can do better. Maybe if I do try harder, I can save myself. And all of a sudden, we don't need Jesus anymore. We just need our list. But here's the problem. This leads us somewhere. Here's where it leads. Legalism is a sneaky trick that allows us to compare ourselves to others. Jesus told a story in Luke chapter 18 about two men who came to the temple to pray. And the first one is a Pharisee, and the second is a tax collector. And the Pharisee gets up to pray, and he says, God, I thank you that I am not like other men. Would you like that if that's how I started prayers at church? God, I thank you that I'm not like these losers. I am not like other men, extortioners, unjust, adulterers, or even like this tax collector over here. I give tithes of all that I get. I fast every week. Now pay close attention to what's happening here. All this stuff that the Pharisee does and doesn't do is actually good. Right? Adultery is bad. He shouldn't be an adulterer. It's good that he doesn't commit adultery. Extortion is bad. He shouldn't do it. It's good that he doesn't commit extortion. Tithing is good. He's being generous. He's giving of his extra. That's a good thing. Fasting is good. It can bring us closer to God. You see, all this stuff that he's doing is good. So where does it go wrong? It goes wrong when he begins to use those things as the measuring standard of his righteousness. When he begins to say, I am righteous because I'm not an extortionist. I am righteous because I don't commit adultery. I am righteous because I fast. I am righteous because I give. And because I do all of those things better than this guy over here, I am better than him. Here's where legalism really, really shows itself. Anytime you say, God, thank you that I'm not like them, you're a legalist. God, thank you that I don't dress like them. Thank you that I don't think like them. Thank you that I don't go where they go. Thank you that I don't vote how they vote. All of a sudden, I've made my standard the standard of righteousness. And I feel really good about it because I'm so much better than them. Hebrews 10:25 says, don't forsake the assembling of yourselves together, which is essentially saying don't stop meeting together. It's a good thing when God's people come together, right? It's good for Christians to gather together. It's good to come to church. I don't think any of us would argue with that. It's a good thing to go to church. And I could even say good Christians go to church, and you would probably say, yes, that makes sense. Good Christians go to church. But what happens when that becomes a standard of righteousness? When I start walking around in the lobby asking people, so how often do you come to church? How often do you come to church? Hey, I didn't see you here last week. What's that? You come 60% of the time. That's pretty good, but I come 75% of the time, so you're here and I'm here. And by the way, friends, if we play this game, guess who wins? See, legalism is this thing that we can do where we create standards and then we use those standards to make ourselves feel better about ourselves because we're better than others. And this is a problem because ultimately this kind of legalism almost always leads to judgment and separation. You see, the first step is when I say, okay, I'm going to take a good thing and make it the standard of my righteousness. And then the second step is when I say, all right, because this is the standard of my righteousness and I do this better than you, therefore, I'm a pretty good Christian. But here's where it really gets bad is when I take that third step and I say, because I do this better than you, you are not a good Christian. And I've all of a sudden moved into the realm of God, passing judgment on who is and who is not righteous. This is what the Pharisees were doing when they went to Galatia. They said, look, I know you guys heard from Paul, you don't really have to try harder, you just have to follow Jesus. But look, following Jesus is here, but look at all of this that we've added on. Yeah, we obey the law. We don't eat bacon. We honor the Sabbath. We have religious holidays. Look at all this that we do better than you. You know what, Galatians? I'm not even sure you guys are Christians at all. And the Galatians said, wait a minute. What's going? We thought that was all, but maybe there is more to it. This is very easy for us to do at church. To create these standards and then judge others by those standards, and having judged them, to separate from them. This is why if you drive around Dayton, you will see thousands of churches, right? With lots of different names. You'll see the Baptists and the Methodists. You'll see the Presbyterians. You'll see the Catholics. You'll see the Lutherans. You'll see the Wesleyans. You'll see those more pious, non-denominational ones, right? Where do all these churches come from? Well, at some point in their history, there was a difference. And somebody said, well, you guys believe this and we believe this, and we're right and you're wrong, so we're going to judge you to not be as good as us, and we're going to separate from you. And some of us have experienced this on a very personal level. Maybe you've been in a church where legalism has really run amok, and you've discovered that sometimes churches are made up of people who are very judgmental about how you look, how you dress, the way you talk, the way you live, where you go in your off time, what your behavior is, how you vote, how you look. All this stuff comes into play. And you end up sometimes with these churches that are just basically a whole bunch of people that are exactly like each other. Right? They do everything the same. They dress alike, they think alike, they talk alike, they vote alike, and they create this little holy huddle, and they say, if you're not just like us, you're not welcome here. Some of you have been there. And you know the pain of being on the outside looking in and wondering, how good do I have to be? How hard do I have to try to get into the holy huddle? And eventually, you just want to walk away. But unfortunately, sometimes people don't just walk away from that church. They walk away from their faith. They walk away from Jesus because of their experience with legalism. And I'm pretty confident that right here in this room, that's where some of you are. I'm pretty confident that some of you who are watching online today, that's where you are. You've experienced legalism in the church. And you've realized that either you can't try harder or you don't want to try harder, and you're ready to walk away. Before you do that, can I just talk to you about that just for a second? I want to give you a gentle warning. Now, I'm not going to excuse legalism, right? I mean, I hope you're hearing me that I think it's wrong, I think it's awful, it's from the pit of hell. But I want you to understand that if you think you can walk away from legalism in a church and be free of it, you are very quickly going to discover that legalism is everywhere. If you leave the church to get rid of legalism, you're just going to walk into a culture that has embraced a new kind of legalism, a legalism of conformity. You see, this is the legalism of the world. The world says, you need to look like everyone else. You need to think like everyone else. You need to talk like everyone else. And if you don't use just the right words, and if you don't have just the right ideas, then we are going to push you away, and we are going to fire you off to the extremes. This causes some people to live lives of fear. Right? They live their life in fear of saying something that's politically incorrect. They live their lives in fear of saying something that's going to be heard the wrong way. They live in fear of offending the wrong person, of taking the wrong stance on an issue, or maybe of having something 3 years ago that they did or said that's going to come back to bite them later. All of this is the legalism of conformity. Now, you can use it to your advantage, okay? You can find people out there who are worse than you. You can find a person who is more bigoted than you. You can find a person that is less enlightened than you. You can find a person who maybe isn't quite as empathetic as you. You can find a person out there who is more intolerant than you. They're out there, and when you find those people, you can compare yourself to them, and you're going to feel really good about yourself. And you're going to be like, that's it, I'm doing better. I'm trying harder. But at the same time, you can also always find someone who's doing better than you. Because you can find someone out there who is less bigoted than you. And you can find someone out there who is more enlightened than you. You can find someone out there who's way better at empathy than you are, and you can find someone who is way less intolerant than you are. And when you find that person, guess what? You are no longer good enough. And now you have to try harder. And you are right back where you started. You see, the legalism of conformity is just the newest world religion. It's just another religion of try harder. But Jesus doesn't want you there. Paul didn't want the Galatians there. And so Paul here is calling the Galatians saying, return to the gospel. Because the only solution for the try harder religion is the gospel. So look what Paul says. This is Galatians 1, 3 through 5. Paul says, grace to you and peace from God our Father and the Lord Jesus Christ, who gave himself for our sins to deliver us from the present age, according to the will of our God and Father, to whom be the glory forever and ever. Let me show you what Paul is saying here. First of all, notice there's a past, present, and future element to what he's teaching here. See, look, in the past, Jesus did the work so that in the present you can be delivered, and in the future you will be in glory forever and ever with God. That's the gospel. Did you hear that again? Who did the work? Jesus did the work. You didn't do the work. It's not on you. Jesus did the work to solve your problem now so that you could have a future. That's the gospel. Notice also whose plan this was. It was God's plan. God had the plan. Jesus did the work, and you are simply the beneficiary of this. This is what Paul is trying to tell the Galatians. You didn't do this. Jesus did it for you, so stop trying on your own. But I want you to see the two most important words in this verse, all right? The two most important words here are grace and peace. Now, you're going to see these words over and over and over for the next coming weeks. As we read all the way through the rest of Paul's letters, he starts all of his letters by saying grace and peace. And he finishes most of them by saying grace and peace. And the reason is because these two words sum up the gospel better than any two words could. You see, it's God's grace that causes him to give us what we don't earn. And that's salvation. And when God graciously gives us what we can't earn, we can now be at peace with him. And when we are at peace with him, we can be at peace with ourselves. And so when we receive grace, we live at peace. And then it affects our relationships as well, because if we want to pursue peace with others, we understand now that we do that by extending grace to them. This is the gospel. Those who accept grace have peace. Those who extend grace live at peace. This is what God has done for you. You can't do it for yourself. Don't try harder. Rest in him. Now, some of you have been doing this Christianity thing for decades. And this morning I want to call you back to the gospel. Come back to the gospel that saved you. Take a deep look inside your heart and find those places where you've tried harder, where you've given yourself over to legalism, where you said, you know what, this is impressive to God. Begin to let go of those and rely simply on Jesus and what he has done for you. But I also know that there are some of you who are here, there are some of you who are watching, and you have never given control of your life over to Jesus. And I know that there are nights when you lie awake in bed and you can't sleep because you're asking yourself, have I done enough? Am I good enough? And let me invite you today. Leave behind the religion of try harder and come to Jesus. Give your life to him and receive the grace and peace that he has purchased for you. Right now, you don't have to do anything special. There's no ceremony you have to go through. There's no words you need to say. You don't need to come down front. You don't even need to be here. Right now, right where you are, you can simply say, God, I give you control of my life. Give me your grace and your peace. and he will begin this amazing work inside of you, changing you from the inside out so you will be the person he created you to be if you'll give him control today. Let's pray. Father, we are so grateful for your love. We are so grateful that you didn't leave us here on our own to just keep trying, but that you were willing to send your son to do for us what we could never do for ourselves. Father, thank you that Jesus was willing to take upon himself all of our imperfections so that we could be perfect like him. And I want to pray this morning for my friends who are here, who are watching, who are wrestling today with whether or not to give themselves to you. Father, send your Spirit right now. Allow your Spirit to break down the resistance. Allow your Spirit to do his work of convicting in their heart and drawing them to you. Father, I pray for all of us, some of us who have known you for such a long time, that you would point out to us this morning where legalism has crept in, where we've begun comparing ourselves to ourselves and comparing others to ourselves instead of simply looking to you as the standard. Father, help us to shed that today, to rely only on you, to rely only on Jesus. In your name, amen.
We are a Christ-centered and grace-oriented church on a mission to connect as many people as possible to Jesus. And we want to connect you to Jesus also because we think he can change your life. Now, we know that we're not perfect. In fact, we believe that nobody is perfect. We've all got stuff in our life. We've got hurts from the past. We've got guilt that we carry. We have people who have let us down, and we've got life situations that have really messed us up. But we think that when we bring all of our imperfections to Jesus, he begins to shape us and change us into the people he created us to be. And we want that for you. In fact, we hope that if you can be a part of our community, Jesus will change us and he will change you. And hey, I would love it if you would plan a visit and come and join us some Sunday.